Hello and welcome to the sixth of 8 lectures in the series Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This series is produced by Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, in cooperation with Third Age Learning KW. These lectures were presented at Rim Park in Waterloo between January 9th and February 27th, 2020. This lecture, Martin Luther and Care of the Soul, is delivered by Reverend Dr. Kristine Lund, Interim Principal Dean and Director of Spiritual Care and Psychotherapy Programs at Martin Luther University College.
But anyways, thank you for your warm welcome, and thank you for all of you to come out on this snowy afternoon to have the next installment of this series on Martin Luther. And today I'm going to talk about Martin Luther and the care of the soul. And perhaps that makes sense when you hear my background, my interest in psychotherapy, my interest in mental health, and perhaps you know something about Luther's challenges with mental health, so maybe you're already getting a sense of how this comes together. If you don't, then hopefully by 3:30 you will. So let me just give a little bit of a framework of where we're going this afternoon. I'd like to sort of build on layers. I want to start with the medieval world understanding of mental illness, because if you were here when Mark Harris was here, he talked context, right? So we need to understand the context that Luther found himself in, and how was mental health or mental illness understood in his day and age. And I'll take us a little bit further back than Luther and bring us up to the medieval time. I'll talk a little bit about Martin Luther's experience of mental illness. It's fairly well documented, both in what he has written and what others have written, that he had some challenges in that way. I want to talk about Martin Luther's relationship with Johann Staupitz, who was a very important mentor to Luther, had a very significant impact on his experience of mental illness, and ultimately had a significant influence in terms of his theological change in seeing the world, which ultimately led to the Reformation. Following on that, I want to move more to modern day, talk about the therapeutic relationship, and then finally spiritually integrated psychotherapy. If my timing is right, I think we'll get to the end of the therapeutic relationship probably by the break, but let's see how it goes. So let's begin by talking a little bit about how mental illness was thought about in some of the earliest ideas. One of the earliest ideas about mental illness that it was caused by supernatural forces. So when individuals presented with strange symptoms, if they acted oddly, often evil spirits were thought to have inhabited the individual. These spirits were the cause of unusual thoughts and behavior. So if that's what we believe, then what might be the solution? Somehow we've got to get the evil spirit out. And so there was an adoption of a procedure called Trefening, where the person's skull had a hole bored into it, and it was to let the spirit out. Now, certainly in modern day, we might not think that was such a great idea, but in Luther's day, in the early days, it definitely was. It also usually, as you could imagine, resulted in some blood loss. And at the time, it was also felt that that was a good thing, that with blood loss, the spirit also could be released. And so this is actually one of the earliest surgical practices. There's archaeological evidence going back to the Neolithic times where we find skulls that have bored holes in them. So we're talking about as early as 2500 BCE. And it lets us know that this procedure was prevalent in many parts of many parts of the world, and through a number of periods of time. It seems that it was somewhat successful, and actually quite a few people survived, which maybe you would think would be contraindicated. But in terms of our early understandings of mental health and mental illness, this was very common. So let's go a little bit further in terms of our understanding. You probably know the man by the name of Hippocrates, often associated with medicine, and Galen was a contemporary in around 400 BC. They developed a theory that physical illness was a result of an imbalance in what they called the humors. And there were four: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And they felt that what was important was for there to be balance amongst these humors. And again, they also thought that a way to get balance was by bloodletting. I don't know why people always thought that, but they did. And so they would make incisions and bloodlet in order to try to get rid of the excess energy in one of the humors over the others, to try to get some balance in the humors. And early on, we have some physiological explanations of mental illness as well. So around 400 BC, for example, in the writings of Hippocrates as well as Galen, we find mental illness described as the result of an imbalance in bodily substances. Too much or too little in any one humor results in erratic behavior or mental illness. Certain personality types were the result of particular imbalances of the humors. So, for example, a lot of black bile in the body leads to melancholy. Now, to cure this, the physician would either do bloodletting, where you basically withdraw a whole bunch of blood from the patient in hopes of balancing the humors, or you could change the environment, because there was a belief if you went somewhere different that the environment would impact the body and that would help balance the humors. And certain environments were thought to result in more or less phlegm, more or less black bile, and so on. So by simply going somewhere humid for the while, for example, you could restore the balance of the humors and the pathology would disappear. So we've now switched to a more physiological understanding, not only of mental illness, but personality as well. So do you think that's why people go south to Florida? Maybe it would be a case we could make, right? It balances I got to go to Jamaica or Saint Martin. It'll balance my humors. I could try that on my principal dean. I wonder if he'd buy it. My hunch is not likely. But certainly there was a belief system. And we do know that sunlight, vitamin D absorption does impact people's mental health. We know it even here when we have a series of gray days and then all of a sudden the sun comes out. Don't people seem happier? Right? So again, some of these ideas follow through what they were figuring out in 400 BC. We understand even in our own way now. So there was some experiential evidence that would support the development of how they understood mental health and mental illness to both be developed but also to be addressed. Okay, and here is a little chart about if we look at the balancing of the humors and how, I have a little thing here, but they told me I have to share between the right side and the left side, so let me see if I can do that. So you can see here that you have two axes, right? Stable to unstable and extroverted to introverted. And you can see if if you're up here where it's more stable in the phlegmatic humor, you're more calm, even-tempered, reliable. Down here you start to be more careful, passive in the introversion. In the melancholic, you can see where, as you get toward unstable, moody, anxious, rigid, sober, pessimistic, all of this. If the melancholic humor is unbalanced. And then the choleric, again, you see on the extroverted side, more active, optimistic, impulsive, and then on this side, aggressive, restless, and touchy. And now to be fair, we'll go over to this side. And if you're on the sanguine side, again, on the extroverted, you have the sociable, outgoing, right? So you see how these both personality characteristics and also experiences of mental health were believed to be related to different humors. And then if you were moody, then they would think one of the humors was out of balance. We need to bring it into balance, right? And to some degree, this carries through when we hear language like phlegmatic or bucolic, or there's a hearkening back to a more ancient understanding of the body, even though there can be some ways that it fits our medical understanding at this point. So a man by the name of Moses Maimonides, he expressed in the 12th century that it is known that passions of the psyche produce changes in the body that are great, evident and manifest to all. On this account, the movements of the psyche should be kept in balance, and no other regimen should be given precedence. So again, if you can think about how you understand mental health now, you can see where there's kind of some threads that carry through history. We have different understandings, perhaps, of origin, or perhaps different understandings how context or life experiences or environment impact mental health. But you can see where there are some, ongoing threads that go through history in our understanding of mental illness. So let's go on to the 14th century. And this is getting us toward the time of Luther. And as we move forward in the 14th century, we see again how people are beginning to attribute mental illness to supernatural forces. So early on we had that. Then with Hippocrates and Galen and that whole period of time, we moved away from that. And now with the 14th century, we're coming back to that. And so now the idea of being embodied by an evil spirit and precisely of demonic possession becomes, again, a more popular a belief. And the possession was actually the act of the devil himself. This is where the witch trials come from. That happened both in North America, in the States, and in Europe. Many of the women who were burned at the stake as witches had a variety of sources of odd behavior. Like they behaved outside of what was understood to be normal in that moment. And some of it would have been mental health related. Others might have been some kind of physical illness that again led to odd behavior. And some of it may actually have been things that were against the belief system of the time and led to the witch burnings. But again, at that time, it was thought that those women embodied an evil spirit. And so they had to be dealt with. And most often, they were dealt with very harshly. It was not a nice experience. And so we see that the progress that was made during the time of the Greeks and Romans, now at this period of time, is reversed. And particularly it's reversed because the increasing power of the church, in particular the Roman Catholic Church, and the control that they had on the society and what was understood as appropriate behavior. The Roman Empire had fallen. If you were here for Mark Harris's lecture, you remember his talk about the bubonic plague and how Europe lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population during that time to the bubonic plague. You can only imagine how much fear that instilled in the population. I mean, we have 7 cases of coronavirus in Canada. How much fear and anxiety there is with 7 cases with modern medicine where people are quarantined. Okay, so go back to the 14th century where you've got 1/3 to 1/2 of the population dying and no antibiotics, no ways to manage, no understanding of where this comes from. There had to be large spread anxiety within the population. So you can see some of the context that's laid for the church to become more powerful, their belief system around the devil, evil, and how this is influencing people's understanding of mental illness. So, how do you deal with that then? If we think mental illness is a result of the devil, then we would get ways of responding like exorcisms, fasting, flogging, prayer, touching of relics, chanting, visiting holy sites, holy water. All of these were used to try to rid the person of the devil's presence. Probably sometimes it worked, right? I mean, rituals can be helpful. Symbolic actions as using holy water or praying or fasting, they can be helpful and supportive of mental health. So probably sometimes it worked. Or maybe it stabilized things. When it didn't work, again, there tended to be harsh repercussions, and sometimes people were executed because of the perceived perception that this was the devil's influence. And again, we start to see, and we'll know more about this when we talk about this with Luther, an understanding of coming back to supernatural powers and how this was a source of fear for many who lived in this time. And again, if you think about it, they were living in a time of great instability. There was economic, political, religious, social instability. All of these forces then lay open the opportunity for these kinds of beliefs to emerge. What happens when we're anxious? We reach for solutions to help to diminish our distress. We would like certainty. We would like to feel like we're in control. We want life to be predictable. So if the church tells me that this is about supernatural forces and you do X, Y, and Z to address this, why wouldn't they? You know, we could look back and go, well, that's just ridiculous. Why would they do that? Why would they believe that? Well, in a way, it's not fair to do that because we're looking back with 20/20 vision. So we have to kind of put ourselves in the place of a medieval person. And they had these 200 years of the bubonic plague. They'd watch family and friends die. Life was incredibly unpredictable, sociologically, economically. You give me an answer that sounds reasonable and logical, I'm going to go for it because it's the best one I got, right? And so that is the context into which Luther was born into. It isn't until into the 18th century that things really change. We start to see the asylum system develop in the 18th century, which isn't necessarily a better option, but it was an option that was developed. Then that's a little bit outside of the scope of what I want to talk about today, but I will pick it up around Freud in the 19th century when we get to talk about the therapeutic relationship. So let me look at Luther's context and Luther's experience of mental health. So just to remind you, in case not all of you have been here for all of the lectures, Luther was born November 10th, 1483 in Eisleben, Germany. He was born in a time of significant change. Okay, so you're remembering they've come through this 200 years of the plague. There's a lot of social, economic, political change. There's conflict with the Roman Catholic Church. There's been the West-East schism in the church. And Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World when I think Martin Luther was 10. The Gutenberg printing press has been developed and in its early infancy is starting to produce pamphlets and other documents, which is also really what supported Luther's ability to become as well known as he became, and for people to even know something about him before he arrived to the various places that he traveled to, was the rise of the printing press. So there was a lot of change going on during this time. So Luther was born into uncertain times, some of them exciting and interesting in terms of the printing press, Christopher Columbus, others not so. Others were anxiety producing. He was born into a religious family. of that time and social situation. His father was a miner. They had means. It was not a poor family. They took God and the church very seriously. And it's clear that Luther grew up in a typical German medieval family. Robert Cole writes that Luther grew up fearing God, knowing that he was supposed to love his neighbors, and that priests served as God's special instruments for mediating divine power. He heard Bible stories and worshiped the triune God, within which whom he learned to approach largely through ritual. Right? So through the Catholic Mass, he approached God largely through ritual. Erik Erikson, perhaps some of you are familiar with that author, had written a book called The Young Luther, looking at the life of Luther more through a psychoanalytic lens. And in that book, he talks about Luther's father being rather grim and judging and consequently harshly punitive. Since his book, there's been some more historical and archaeological literature, archaeological excavations that lead us to believe that that might have been true of Luther's father, but actually it was fairly typical of all German men and German fathers of the time. So while Luther's father might have been prone to punish Luther harshly, so would have other fathers of the day and age. So it wouldn't have been that Luther thought he was being treated differently than his friends, his pals. But we do know that both his father and mother used corporal punishment as a way to discipline their son. We also know that school would have been a place where Luther would have experienced teachers as being harsh authoritarians, and corporal punishment would have also been the norm for schoolyard misbehaviors. Later in life, Luther described the general atmosphere of fear and authority as something that had been chronic throughout his life. He recalls an experience in his early days of school when he was thrashed 15 times by his teacher for failing to conjugate and decline a certain Latin verb. The difficulty was, Luther explains, that it was a verb the class had not yet been taught. So how could he decline it? However, there would not have been much ability to tell the teacher that, right? In an authoritarian classroom, it was not likely a student could point out to their teacher that he was wrong. And so Luther couldn't decline the verb. He had never learned it, and he was thrashed 15 times. In a treatise in 1524, he reflected that he learned less than nothing despite all the flogging, trembling, anguish, and misery in school. Now, we know that to be not quite true, because actually Luther was quite bright and ultimately got a doctorate, so he obviously did learn something in school. But in his writing, we can appreciate that that learning came at a great cost, right? That it caused him great anguish and great distress to be in that kind of a learning environment. Then if we add to that the fear of God that was perpetuated by the church and the theology of the time, one can only imagine how this resulted in recurring bouts of depression, anxiety, and obsessive thoughts of unworthiness for Luther. So I think it's important for us to understand the larger social context that Luther was born into that would lead to his development of depression, anxiety, and a lot of compulsive thinking. That is not to say that there weren't others in Luther's time that also had depression and anxiety because of the social context as well. So I'm not saying it was only Luther, but through Luther's writings, we have a window into Luther's experience and the depths of the anguish that he experienced. As well in his writings, Luther is quite happy to tell us of the physical symptoms he experienced, and if you're interested, you can read lots about his difficulties with constipation, his gastrointestinal distress, and his very constant experience of gout. particularly later in life. Luther was eating a very rich diet, primarily a lot of meat, probably not a lot. If there were vegetables, they were more root. And so Luther, towards the end of his life, struggled a lot with gout. And of course, at the time, they would have not understood the relationship of gout to nutrition. Luther was also drinking a lot of beer because you couldn't drink the water. So you drank the beer, right? It wasn't safe to drink the water, or you were afraid of drinking the water because of the bubonic plague. So they drank a lot of beer. And so this did not support his physical well-being either, and probably also not his mental health. We know now that good nutrition is very important to supporting mental health. And as our bodies and minds and all are connected, if we are having physical issues, they impact our mental health. Our mental health also impacts our physical issues. So we know that in adulthood, Martin Luther experienced repeated bouts of depression and anxiety. So let's talk a little about the young Luther. And let me just have a little bit of coffee. So I talked a little bit about the family that he grew up in, and certainly in Luther's young adult years, his piety reflected a medieval understanding of God and the world. This included believing in a God with superhuman abilities that could be mediated by the saints. However, this medieval worldview also included demons and witches who had superhuman powers and who were in defiance of God. So, it's sort of like spiritual warfare, the good guys against the bad guys, right? Rituals were an important means of manipulating divine power in order to combat evil forces. Luther learned in his family and from the theologian and spiritual teachers in his Augustinian order that sinful people were only capable of responding to selfish desires within. Ham notes that the belief at this time would have been that sinful people could not feel the love of God or make a true repentance in a loving accord with Christ's passion, but could only go as far as the sorrow for sin that comes from the egotistical motive of fearing punishment. These sinners are like the criminal who is led to the gallows and regrets his crimes, not because he understands them as such or inwardly abhors them, but because he's afraid of the gallows. Therefore, every sinner who does not have God's justifying and reforming grace is only capable of a shabby kind of gallows remorse. The merciful love of God entering the soul is the one thing that brings sinners back into God's orbit. So again, in terms of Luther's view of how this worked, that would have been his understanding. So you can appreciate that with all of this happening in Luther's world, Luther was in an ongoing state of anxiety and tribulation regarding his own salvation and relationship with God. Luther's image of God was that of a relentless judge who required perfect repentance and atonement for every sin without the possibility of remission unless there were acts of confession and repentance with true remorse and good works. This ongoing lived experience of believing in an accusing and angry God increased Luther's desperate need for purity and holiness. Consequently, Luther had the need to confess even the smallest offense because it was such a great source of suffering and anguish for Luther. Luther himself writes, "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that God was placated by my satisfaction. I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God and said, as if indeed it is not enough that miserable sinners, eternally lost through original sin, are crushed by every kind of calamity by the law of the Decalogue, without having God add pain to pain by the gospel, and also by the gospel threatening us with his righteousness and wrath. Thus I raged with a fierce and troubled conscience. Can you just hear the depth of anguish in that? And the hopelessness and the despair, and how would Luther make anything different? As a monk, he would flog himself to the point of drawing blood. He would fast. Most of the pictures we see of Luther are when he's a little older and he's a little robust. Looks like the beer and the rich diet has been working. But when Luther was a younger man, when you see even the picture that's up now, he was much thinner. And partly it was because of these ascetic practices of denying oneself as a way to try to make things right with God. Okay, so that's a little bit of context around Luther's mental health. Let's talk about when he goes to the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg. And this is actually you can go visit this monastery in Wittenberg. And we did when we were in Germany a number of years ago. So when Luther entered the monastic life, one book that was available to him was the Bible. And again, you might think that's sort of obvious. But not in Luther's age. The Bible was not readily available. The printing press was just developing. People did not have copies in the Bible in their home. He had not read much of the Bible. And so when Luther received this Bible, and later in his life he describes it as a Bible that was bound in red leather, he read it over and over. He devoured it. He voraciously read. And we understand that this intense and repetitive reading of the Bible would ultimately have significance on the course of events in the future. So we're not sure what propelled him to have such an intense need to read the Bible, but it seems that it very well could have been related to his intense search for answers. Luther was desperately searching for the answers to his difficulties, the problems that likely sent him to the monastery in the first place. Luther had been powerfully influenced by humanist thinking at the university and was a student of philosophy, so he had a strong belief that if he went to the source itself, he might at last find the answers to his questions, if such answers existed. And he was desperate for the answers. So Luther observes in his own writing that he was quite an oddity at the time. As a young monk, he was different than the other young monks because he was one of the very few that read the Bible much. And again, we might think, well, isn't that weird? These people are in the Augustinian order and they're not reading the Bible. But again, this was not common practice. But Luther was devouring the scriptures at this time. This also might have been what drew Luther to Johann Staupitz, and I'm going to talk about him next. Johann Staupitz was Luther's mentor, and he himself was a bit of an oddity in that day and age because he too was drawn to reading the scriptures and deeply studying them and becoming familiar. And so that might have been how Luther and Staupitz got connected, because Staupitz saw in Luther this potential in this young friar. So let's talk about Johann Staupitz. We don't know when Johann Staupitz was born. We do know he died in 1524. Staupitz became Luther's superior when he was named the Vicar General of the Augustinians in Germany. And he oversaw a number of the monasteries in Germany. And seeing Luther's distress, and at the same time recognizing Luther's academic ability, Staupitz sent Luther to the University of Wittenberg to study theology and philosophy. So Luther received his doctorate in 1512, became a professor of the Bible, and remained in this position until the end of his life. Now, there were various events that happened, but he kept this position at Wittenberg, and he loved to teach the Bible. Both Staupitz and Luther write about how Luther was obsessive about confession. And remember the angst and the distress that Luther was in about not getting everything right, not knowing if he had confessed enough. In fact, Staupitz got to the point of being so fed up with his maddeningly over-scrupulous confessee. Once Luther spent 6 hours in the confessional, probing every nook and cranny of any possible sin, and then going back and probing even more. Luther was determined to get to the bottom, but he never did. Kind of like if you ever have any perfectionist tendencies, you know you never get there, right? All Luther knew was that as soon as he left the confessional, there likely still lurked sins that he had not remembered, and according to all the church doctrine, a sin must be recalled and confessed before it could be repented of and forgiven. So what if he didn't remember something? Or what if he didn't remember it fully enough? And so this really fed Luther's compulsivity and obsessiveness around identifying his sinfulness. And he would reflect, haven't I tried hard enough? How do the others do it? Am I more sinful than they? He concluded that he must be, and therefore must try even harder. And so Staupitz's frustration with Luther grew. Could you imagine being Luther's mentor and his confessor and sitting in the little confessional box for 6 hours and Luther's not even done? Like, come on, man. So Staupitz, on more than one occasion, and we know this from the writings of Luther and of Staupitz, tried to shock Luther out of his downward spiral of navel-gazing. And Staupitz said, God is not angry with you. You are angry with God. Don't you know that God commands you to hope? And another time he said, look here, if you expect Christ to forgive you, come in with something to forgive. Parricide, blasphemy, adultery, instead of all these peccadillos. So clearly Staupitz was getting frustrated with Luther getting down to this minutia of things that Staupitz wouldn't even deem relevant to confess. But Luther, again, can you just hear the anguish he must have been in, that he had to go finer and finer and finer and finer to try to get the last sin. So Luther's struggles tended to be more with his own doubts that he could never be good enough, no matter how he tried, that he could never be worthy of God's mercy, grace, and salvation. He knew that the life of a monk was designed to free him from temptation, to keep him busy with praying and singing and doing so that there was no more room for other things. If he had become a lawyer, there could have been much more temptations. So being a monk should have sort of narrowed the opportunities, right? But for Luther, the more he tried to be holy, the more he saw he couldn't be. And again, can you appreciate kind of when you're on that treadmill, there's no getting off. So at some point, Luther came to the conclusion that he deserved God's wrath. Now, interestingly enough, Staupitz was a man of his age in the Middle Ages, right? But he had an incredibly healthy view of God. And we don't know why, but I suspect it might be because Staupitz also studied the scriptures in a very significant way. And I suspect, we don't know, but I suspect that informed Staupitz's understanding of God and God's relationship with people. Because for Luther, God was only a harsh judge. But for Staupitz, God was somebody who loved us and who had mercy on us. And so he approached Luther from this perspective. And he took a personal and fatherly interest in Luther. And the importance on Luther's life cannot be exaggerated. Staupitz was a significant influence on Luther. He early on saw the genius of Luther, the potential, and he wanted to do everything he could to help Luther find his way. And yet, while he seemingly helped Luther, he ultimately would not end up following Luther, but rather stayed loyal in the Catholic Church. So that's kind of an interesting turn of events, which happened a number of years down the road, which is sort of outside the lecture today. But it is interesting that Staupitz and Luther did not follow the same path to the end. Staupitz remained loyal to the Catholic Church. Staupitz, as the Vicar General, needed to travel to all these different places, and he needed somebody to replace him at Wittenberg. And so he chose Martin Luther to take his place, and that led him to do his doctorate and led him to teach. And actually, Luther argued with Staupitz. He did not see himself as a good candidate for doctoral work. He didn't think he was smart enough. He didn't think he thought he was too young. And yet Staupitz was very persistent. And finally, Luther agreed and went and studied for his doctorate, which ultimately led him, with Staupitz's mentoring, to have significant time with the scriptures, which would lead him to a much different understanding of the relationship with God. We know from Luther's writings that he calls Johann Staupitz his father in God. So he recognized that fatherly relationship. And we also know from his writings that if it had not been for Dr. Staupitz, I would have sunk in hell. That's a pretty profound statement on somebody's influence on your life. I'm just noticing the time, so we're going to rip right along here. As I had said earlier, that Staupitz, Luther's scruples were exhausting for Staupitz, and yet Staupitz hung in there with him, and Staupitz challenged him. And Staupitz encouraged him to read the scriptures and to look at the relationship with God differently. And over time, in the context of the relationship with Staupitz, Luther's image of God evolved to include the love of Christ freely given to believers. And Luther writes this: "At last, by the mercy of God, mediating day and night, I gave heed to the context of the words, namely, in the righteousness of God is revealed, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith. As it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. Here I felt that I was altogether born again, had entered paradise itself through open gates. There a totally other face of the entire scripture showed itself to me." So, can you imagine what that must have been like for Luther? Now, it didn't happen overnight. I mean, he and Staupitz struggled, had their challenges. Staupitz was frustrated. Luther was despairing. A lot of emotional distress and anxiety and despair. But in the relationship, both Staupitz and Luther hung in there. And Luther, with his studying of Scripture, Staupitz of encouragement of the studying of Scripture, supported Luther to come to a different place. And you probably know how that story ends, right? We have a different understanding of God's grace and mercy, which significantly shaped the Reformation. The Webster Dictionary includes in its definition of, just looking at on the right slider if I'd gotten out of control with reading what I was reading. Webster's Dictionary includes in its definition of Reformation the acknowledgement of the beginning of the movement in the 16th century that challenged some of the Roman Catholic doctrine, which resulted in the formation of the Protestant Church. However, it also defines Reformation as the act of reforming, the state of being reformed. The act of reforming, the state of being reformed. And it's in this context that I want to talk about the therapeutic relationship. And stay with me. That might seem like a leap to you, but there is actually a connection. So first, I just wanted to say a little bit about Freud. So we're going to jump ahead a few hundred years to the end of the 19th century, and now we're seeing psychotherapy understood in slightly a different way. It's coming out of the medical profession. Freud was a doctor, a neurologist to be exact. He was the founder of psychoanalysis. It became known as the talking cure, and it later was soon expanded on by Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. And then after World War II, we see it being influenced by a more humanistic approach, when there was much opposition to the sort of the reductionist approach and the deterministic approach of Freudian psychoanalysis. It is important, though, to note that one of Freud's contributions is that he acknowledged that human beings carry within them the seeds of their construction as well as their destruction. And that, at the time, was a new and radical idea. So up until this time, it was thought that the reasons for deviant and unacceptable forms of behavior were some of the things that we had talked about before. And the cure was usually isolation, punishment, abandonment, or death. The important thing at this time also to recognize is, as we have the rise of medical science, technology, the scientific revolution, it's well on its way by the time Freud arrives, we now begin to have a separation between science and religion. And in 2020, we still are living that separation. And that I'll talk a little bit more when I talk about spiritually integrated psychotherapy. Because in an interesting kind of way, it's coming back. But it got separated at about this time, and there has been, through the whole history of psychiatry, psychotherapy, medicine, a real separation and an antithesis between science and religion. Okay, so let me go on and talk about the therapeutic relationship. Can you see the little, what it says? There's a man in a waiting room, or a man in a therapy room with a goldfish I couldn't find one with a dog. I could have maybe put Annie's picture there. That might have been more appropriate. But the caption says, "You don't say much, but I'm told it's the therapeutic relationship that counts." So let me talk a little bit about the therapeutic relationship. But first, let me give you a couple scenarios of what brings people to therapy in this day and age. Clients request assistance for a lot of different reasons, but at the Glebe Center, the predominant request of therapy is for anxiety and depression. Hear any connection between now and Luther? Anxiety and depression? Anxiety and depression? We'll talk about that a little more. But here's a few common scenarios, and again, these are all pseudonyms, so they're not real people. David, a 42-year-old man who's been married 12 years with 2 children, aged 10 and 8, comes into therapy because his wife thinks it might be helpful. It's always the wife, right? He doesn't know why he has no motivation in life. He says that he loves his wife and kids, but doesn't know what the point of it is. He observes that I have a good job, I make decent money, we've bought a house, and the kids are doing fine, but I thought there'd be more to life. I just have no motivation to do anything. I don't know what's wrong with me. Second scenario. Jamie and Kelly have been married for 5 years. They've come in for counseling because they seem to argue about everything these days. And third and last scenario, I could go on and give you 200, but we'll just stick with 3. Sam is an international student studying chemical engineering. He is in his 2nd year of his program. He did well in his 1st year, but now feels no motivation to go to class or do his schoolwork. What's the point? He says to his therapist. He reports that his despair has increased in light of recent world events. So will these clients encounter in a therapist somebody like Johann Staupitz or not? What kind of relationship will develop between the therapist who engages these clients? There's been significant research in the last 40 years about the importance of the therapeutic relationship as it relates to the process of healing and change. And it's actually quite instructive, because sometimes we can get distracted and into the weeds around techniques and modalities. So it's helpful to understand the importance of the therapeutic relationship. So for example, Bergen and Garfield write, there is massive evidence that psychotherapeutic techniques do not have special effects. Yet there is tremendous resistance to accepting this finding as a legitimate one. And when I was being educated as a therapist in the mid-90s, it was all about the schools of therapy, and the schools would argue with each other about which was more effective. And you were sort of supposed to be pure to a school, right? But things have changed now. Numerous interpretations of the data have been given in order to preserve the idea that technical factors have substantial, unique, and special effects. The reasons for this are not difficult to surmise. Such pronouncements essentially appear to be rationalizations that attempt to preserve the role of theories, the status of leaders of such approaches, the technical training programs for therapists, the professional legitimacy of psychotherapy, and the rewards that come to having those supposedly curative powers. Wouldn't it be nice to have the silver bullet that cures anxiety and depression in 2020? And there is some motivation still with certain brands of psychotherapy to try to do that. And I'm not saying that particular modalities aren't helpful. What I am saying is that the research is showing that it's not so much about the modality, it's about the therapeutic relationship. So let me say some more. Prochaska and his colleagues did a lot of research around how do people solve their problems. And they discovered in their work that, that all change is self-change. And by that they mean that really therapy is professionally coached self-change. So they make the observation that the people who come to therapy are those people who have failed in their self-change attempts. And that's a really important thing to remember as a therapist. The people that you're seeing in therapy, it's not like they haven't tried. They have tried. They've read books. They've watched TED Talks. They've talked to their neighbors. They've talked to their doctor. They may have talked to their faith community leader. They've tried nutrition, supplements, exercise, whatever. And their attempts at self-change either haven't worked or haven't worked well enough. Those are the people who seek out therapy. The ones who get a good enough response to their self-change methods don't show up to therapy. Right? And so that's an important thing for us to remember. They also say that the power of the relationship with the therapist is a major healing, curative element. And they cite a number of studies where the quality of the therapeutic relationship is the best predictor of therapeutic outcome, not the modality, the quality of the relationship. And then they go on to say, why would that be? And they propose a couple ideas, well, a few ideas. That the relationship may be healing because it provides a corrective emotional experience. The therapist's benign and benevolent listening and intervening is inherently healing. Talking helps, right? When you're listened to and witnessed, it helps. The relationship may heal because it provides an environment where you can learn different ways to respond to your concern and try them out. And then it also provides support then to go out into your relationships and your world and experiment with them and come back and be able to try again. And so clients can use the relationship as a way of learning and translating into their other relationships outside the therapy room. And the therapeutic relationship can also be the context where the client is supported to be self-accepting of themselves. Hear anything about Luther and Staupitz in there? We'll come back to that. How am I doing for time? Okay, just give me a couple. They stole a little bit of my time with the announcements, so give me just a few more minutes, and then we'll go for the break. Okay? Okay, so you maybe have heard of Carl Rogers, right? Heard of Carl Rogers? Yeah, well, he was one of the early psychologists who wrote about the importance of the therapeutic relationship. And he noted, if I can provide a certain type of relationship, the other person will discover within himself or herself the capacity to use that relationship for change and growth, and personal development will occur. And then he went on to describe the things that you've probably heard that are crucial qualities for the therapist: realness or genuineness, non-possessive caring, trust, respect, empathic understanding, and sensitive and accurate listening. Sometimes it's called unconditional positive regard, right? Yalom, anybody read Yalom? He's an existential therapist. He concludes that it's the relationship that heals. And that is the single most important lesson that psychotherapists must learn. There is no more self-evident truth in psychotherapy that every therapist observes over and over in clinical work, that the encounter itself is healing for the patient in a way that transcends the therapist's theoretical orientation. Okay, let's just move along here a bit so I can scoot. I want to talk a little bit about Martin Buber before I talk a little bit about the therapeutic relationship. You familiar with Martin Buber? He was a Jewish thinker, wrote I, Thou. You might have heard the I, Thou, I, It parallel. And it becomes really interesting as you think about the therapeutic relationship, because he talks about to be human is to be in relation. We were created to be in relation with other humans, with the created world, with animals. We were created to be in relation. And then he notes two basic ways to be in relationship. The I-it is characteristic of one-way relationship, which relates to the use of objects, and I-thou relationships, which are two-way relationships based in dialogue. And the I-thou relationship could be understood more as a conversation with a trusted person, whereas the I-it relationship would have a more objective or business-like quality. So Buber believed that it was within the I-thou relationship that the divine had the opportunity to be experienced. And in this day and age, we might broaden that to say the sacred, right? Depending on how people understood that. Not everybody's theistic anymore, so they might not use the word divine, but they may say they experience the sacred in the I-thou-ness of a relationship. Interestingly enough, though, Buber said that it was not likely that this would be, experienced in the psychotherapy relationship because of the power imbalance. And then Buber and Carl Rogers had a very famous dialogue where they talked about this. And Buber was saying to Carl Rogers that he really thought that the psychotherapeutic relationship was an I-it relationship because of the imbalance of power. And Carl Rogers was coming from a different space, if you remember the quote that I just read, which he then laid open the possibility for the I-thou, or for the experience of the sacred in the relationship. And ultimately, Buber would say that when the patient and counselor intuited both sides of the relationship simultaneously, the mutuality demonstrates the client's capacity to see oneself and the other at the same time. And then you have the 1 + 1 is more than 2. You have the expansive relationship of the I-thou, the ability for there to be an experience of the sacred. And so that is a really important piece when we think about Staupitz's relationship with Luther, because that would have been an imbalanced relationship. But as we understand that relationship to the degree that we can, since historical, we can see the quality of relationship between those two very much at times had the quality of an I-thou. And so within the therapeutic relationship, there is a similar opportunity for there to be an I-thou relationship. So the clients that I described earlier, clients like Jamie and Kelly and David and Sam, they rarely come to counseling as tormented as Luther was. Most people do not talk about devils. Most people do not talk about God's judgment. Sometimes we get a little bit of the God's judgment piece. However, often clients do come with fears and other difficult feelings that result from their experiences in their family or with others that have left them struggling with their own sense of worth and purpose in life, often resulting in challenges in their relationship. Therefore, at the beginning of therapy, it's important to focus on the relationship, to build the structure, to hold the client in a relationship that allows them then to address the concerns that they come to therapy for. Now, it's not uncommon for a therapist for a client to come to therapy and expect the therapist to fix them, right? You take your car to a mechanic if the engine light goes on. If you got a toothache, you go to the dentist and he fixes it or she fixes it. So why wouldn't you go to a psychotherapist and they'll fix your heart or your emotional or your feelings? Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And so some of the work with clients is helping them recognize that in this collaborative working relationship of the therapeutic process, we look to find the solutions. We look to support the self-change that can occur and look for opportunities for this I-thou relationship to occur. So I'm going to say one more thing and then we're going to break. You remember how Staupitz challenged Luther? Stop bringing these silly things to confession. God's not angry at you, you're angry at God. Now, probably most therapists would not challenge a client in the same kind of direct way that Staupitz challenged Luther. But it doesn't mean that a therapist wouldn't challenge a client. So it's not just all about, let's, hold hands and sing kumbaya, right? It's about, in the therapeutic relationship, working with what a client brings that's a concern for them. And then in that holding environment of the relationship, lift up for the client to see some of their patterns of behavior, some of the ways in being in relationship, some of the ways they believe in the world, some values that they may holding, some ways they don't live with their congruently within their values, inviting clients to explore all of that. And in the lifting up of that for a client to see, it can be incredibly challenging because they're invited to face themselves. And if you've ever needed to face yourself, you know that that can be hard. And Staupitz challenged Luther in that way, to face his demons, literally. And often in the therapeutic relationship, we are lifting up what we're seeing and inviting the client to address the demons that are going on. It is with a hope inside, though, that we can have this I-thou encounter, this mutual engagement, joining together, recognizing that's more than the sum of the parts, and that can facilitate the client to a different kind of self-understanding, which then translates into different behavior. Very similar, again, to what happened with Luther. And as we saw with Luther, that therapeutic relationship then can be tremendously transformative for a client's life. And so as Staupitz's relationship with Luther led to Luther having a much different kind of life and moving toward Reformation, so can a therapist be involved with a client to supporting them to reform what's important in their life. So let me stop there for now. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the cure of the soul, and then I want to talk about spiritually integrated psychotherapy. Okay, Cure of the Soul. What you see is the title, the front cover of a book that Tom O'Connor, Patricia Berenson, and I edited a few years ago, where there was a number of papers that were talking about different aspects of Cure of the Soul. And I couldn't find a good picture to go on the PowerPoint, so that's why you got that. Anyways, I wanted to talk about Cure of the Soul because I think it harkens back to a way of thinking again about the therapeutic relationship in a more holistic manner. We're not just walking around with a head. We are embodied people, we are gendered people, we are cultured people, we are intellectual people. There is a holistic way of looking at the human that allows us to think of soul in a little bit differently than maybe the way that you're thinking that, the soul leaves the body when you die. Not so much that kind of soul, but certainly, if we go back to the Greek, Plato and Aristotle used the term to differentiate a medically assisted cure of the body from the cure of the soul, which is done through philosophy and pursuit of the truth. And that's kind of not where we're going. But that's how the Socratic method was developed by Plato, because he wanted to have that separation. So cure is a very strong word in our contemporary society. And people over the years have even titled their books Cure of the Soul. But the Latin word cura can be defined both using the word cure and care. And I think that's an important understanding, or important way of understanding the word cure. Underneath this understanding of care of the soul is a belief that when the soul is troubled, wounded, or confused and lost, it needs both care and cure. And again, if you're thinking about Luther and Staupitz, you can see where that care and cure was so important. Not necessarily that we were curing Luther, but we were addressing his concerns. And Staupitz did that in such a fatherly, caring way, and that impacted Luther greatly. Initially, this was understood more from a pastoral counseling perspective, the care of the soul. It, from a pastoral counseling perspective, both included the support of well-being as healing, but also restoration. And not just personal restoration, but restoration to the community. So again, it's not just about the individual, it's about connection to others. And so it's important as we think about spiritually integrated psychotherapy that we're not so much thinking the soul as part of a person, but rather the soul is in the totality of the person. That is, the person including the body with a focus on thinking, feeling, and action. And so when the therapist nurtures what is deeply human, there is care and cure of the soul included in that. And in the nurture of what is deeply human, it opens up the possibility of the sacred and the experience of the sacred, however that is defined by the person that we're working with. And so with a sense of awe and mystery, therapists can experience the recreating power of the sacred in the midst of the therapeutic relationship. And like I said earlier, traditionally this would have been understood more in Christian circles, but certainly in our pluralistic and multi-faith culture that we're living with in Canada, we're understanding that in a much broader sense. And that from a variety of faith traditions, and actually no faith tradition, we can engage the person in deeply human ways in the therapeutic relationship that leaves space for the experience of the sacred. And the divine, perhaps, if the person's from a theistic tradition. My experience with clients who even define as atheist or agnostic, they still will, many of them, maybe not all of them, but many of them will still resonate with the sacred. What is sacred for them? And so it makes it possible to have those kinds of conversations. Okay, so I wanted to give that little bit of an understanding of how I'm using Cure of the Soul, since it was in the title. And I want to talk a little bit about spiritually integrated psychotherapy. Ken Pargament, who's at Bowling Green University in the States, has done a lot of work in this area and a lot of research with a whole bunch of different populations, young adults, Muslims, Christians, atheists, and he's looked at both when spirituality and religion can be a resource, and also when it can cause spiritual distress, and what happens when we don't pay attention to both when spirituality and religion can be a resource and when it can cause spiritual distress. He's done some research with regards to spiritual distress and discharge times in hospitals, and how if the spiritual care provider in the hospital can attend to a patient's spiritual distress, that it can at times minimize the need for pain medication. It can also result in earlier discharge, which you'd think would be a good thing, but not always recognized. Currently, I actually have a Muslim, I don't have, Luther has a doctoral student, I don't own the student, working on Muslim patients' experience of spiritual distress when they're admitted to the psych ward at Grand River Hospital. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of her research, because I think, again, it's not a well-researched population in this area. There's a lot of challenges to immigrants, particularly with mental health challenges, and it does often raise a spiritual distress, so it'll be really interesting to see what comes of it. So there is more and more of this kind of research happening. And why it's happening, it's because the spirituality of the client, the spirituality of the therapist, and the process of change is not checked at the door. Right? Remember when I talked about earlier with the beginning of Freud and the whole scientific revolution and the development of modern medicine, how religion and science got separated. And so there was this belief system that if you had religious issues, go talk to your priest, pastor, imam, or whatever, your faith community leader, we'll deal with the rest. Well, it's a false assumption, because people don't check that stuff at the door. It's with them. It's impacting their world. And if they're coming to you for psychotherapy because something in their life is causing them distress, we need to be open to the possibility that there may be religious resources that could be helpful, or there could be spiritual distress that's a problem. So at the Glebe Center, when clients come on their intake form, they are asked, do you have any spiritual or religious resources? And they're asked what they are. If they say no, that's fine. No need. If they say yes, that's very helpful for me to know as a therapist. Do they find being in nature helpful? Do they pray? Do they meditate? Do they go to services in their faith community? Are there supportive people in their faith community? As a therapist, that's extremely helpful information for me to know as I'm working with the client, and maybe can encourage them at different times to make uses of these resources. It's also an opportunity for me to discover whether there's areas of spiritual distress, because unfortunately, we've not done a good job often in faith communities where people get harmed. And when they're harmed, they often leave. And then that pain remains unresolved. And it can be part, or if not all, of what brings them to therapy. And so it's important for me to know if there is any kind of spiritual distress. So that's the first thing. We need to realize that clients do not leave their spirituality at the door. They bring in their beliefs and their values. I need to understand how they understand their world. And spiritual problems can be a cause of psychological problems, and psychological problems can be the cause of spiritual problems. Again, think of Luther, back and forth, right? They're kind of intertwined, which, the chicken and the egg, which came first. Spirituality can be a source of the solution to the problem. Spirituality can be a source of resistance to solutions. So if I'm inviting the client to think about something in a particular way and it doesn't fit in their belief system, then clients can resist that opportunity to change in a particular way. As well as the client brings a larger social, cultural, and religious context to psychotherapy. And I need to be aware of that. Otherwise, I could be inappropriately imposing something on a client, or making judgments about a client, that they're deficient in some way, when actual fact, it's part of their context, part of their culture, part of their family system. So orientation of spiritually integrated psychotherapy to the therapist. Similarly, therapists don't leave their spirituality at the door. And I need to be aware of my beliefs and values and how I make use of them with my work with a client. I could be imposing my beliefs and values. I could think there is a right way to be in the world and the client needs to do it my way. That is an unethical imposition of my values, and that can happen religiously as well. Right? So it's important for the therapist to be self-aware so that they aren't doing that with the client. I also have a responsibility as a professional to have a sense of professional spiritual integration. Like, how am I making use of that? What's my own sense of spirituality and religion? What's my knowledge of others? And there is no place for spiritual intolerance as a psychotherapist. That is unethical practice, right? Because again, it comes from a place of judgment. If a spiritual practice is not helpful to a client, I certainly can explore it. But if a client finds it helpful and it's not harm to self or other, I can't tell them it's wrong. That's spiritual intolerance. And so then it requires me to have a certain sense of spiritual literacy, some understanding of faith traditions. I don't have to be an expert in every faith tradition, but if I'm working with a particular population, it is my responsibility to be educated. And then to speak with the client about what's important for them in their faith tradition and how does that impact the work that we're currently doing. And then I need to pay attention to how this impacts the change process. And again, clients can be resistant if they feel that what I'm suggesting is going to impact their spiritual or religious perspective in a negative way. But then that's important for me to know. And then how can we work differently about it? When a client comes in distress to address their concerns, they are often questioning meaning of life questions or their beliefs. Their beliefs may not be quite big enough to fit what they're dealing with. If my child is killed by a drunk driver, why do bad things happen to good people? If I've not come to figure that out in my life, when a traumatic event occurs, my belief systems may not be able to expand enough to be able to hold my working that through. Therapy can be a place where clients can figure that out. I'm not going to tell them the answer to the question, but I'm going to explore it with them. Often with trauma of any kind, car accident, cancer diagnosis, anything, there can be meaning questions, spiritual, religious questions. Where was God? Why did God let that happen? Why am I getting cancer? I'm a good person. Look at that slouch. Nothing's happened to him, right? Like, how do we figure it out? And therapy can be a very important place if the therapist is prepared to engage those questions. So then, again, psychological and spiritual change can go hand in hand, right? Just as Luther belief system was changed, it changed his perspective on the world. They're linked. They go hand in hand. And any modality of therapy, so whether you're using cognitive behavioral therapy or solution focused or whatever it is, any modality can be enhanced by paying attention to the role of spirituality and religion in the therapeutic process. And it can also provide a different understanding on psychological problems, because sometimes people will get stuck in the healing and change process because it's actually a belief system that they're running into, right? That they're getting caught in their shame, or they're getting caught in they've done something wrong and now God made this happen. People still have those belief systems. And if I as a therapist can't invite those conversations, then I may find it difficult to work with that kind of change. So you might say, in this day and age, why would I be concerned or even interested in spiritually integrated psychotherapy? Well, I think in many ways we live in similar times to what Luther did, right? We're not recovering from the Black Plague, but we have a lot of social, economic, and political unrest. We're living, even if you don't believe in climate change, we're living in a time when the earth has been badly damaged by human activity. There is tremendous instability. There's the coronavirus. There's the fires in Australia. There's the tension between the US and Iran. There's the Ukrainian plane that went down. People are responding to this uncertainty, sometimes in positive ways. They're gathering with friends, family, community. They're being supportive. They're finding ways to respond. They're planting trees. They're listening. They're making meals. They're doing lots of things to respond to the uncertainty. Some people are doing some of that. Other people feel quite paralyzed and aren't able to engage that. But they're feeling this uncertainty. And as well, we get lots of messages in our culture about how we're not enough. Right? Look at all the advertising. You know, the next trip to the mall or the next thing you order off of Amazon is going to solve all your problems. Right? And we know they don't. But there's the impulse that they will. So again, this sense of not being good enough that Luther struggled with, I mean, we struggle with it differently than what Luther struggled with it, but that sense of not being enough is hugely present in our culture. And then if you feel like you're not enough and you don't know where the world is going, then it's very easy to come to a place of despair. And what's the point of it? We work with a lot of university students at the Glebe Center. We also work with a lot of community clients as well. We certainly see this level of despair in university students. Why? You know, particularly this year, after the Australian fires, the plane crash, the US and Iran, the coronavirus, like clients are saying, like, why should I bother finishing my education? What's the point? What kind of a world's going to be there when I'm done anyways? Right? So you can hear where people fall into the despair. Now, certainly in the therapy process, we're working with them, you know, to address that. But again, we are in a context where the level of anxiety in our culture is up. And if you are sensitive to that, you're going to easily take it on or be impacted by it. So this is where spiritual integrated psychotherapy can be so helpful, is we can be open to the larger questions of meaning in life. So like, well, why would you finish your degree? Or, you know, you've been married 12 years, your kids are doing fine, you know, you've got the house and the cars and life is good and, you know, what's it all about, Elfie? What is it all about? What do you want it to be about? What gives you hope? Where do you find hope? What gives you meaning? What enhances relationships? What lets you know that you are a beloved person, that you have value just because you're you? Because again, for Luther, that was the message of the gospel. It wasn't about needing to do anything in particular. It was about believing that you are a beloved person of God. Well, how do we invite people in our age to be able to recognize that? And each of us can be the staupitz for somebody else. You don't have to be a therapist. But certainly as a therapist, when people come, that is my stance. I mean, if I was to speak theologically about how I understand my role as a therapist, I say my role as a therapist is to embody the grace of God. And it makes me emotional because I take it very seriously. That my role is to be an inviting presence, to let the person be who they are, to discover, to be accepted, to be understood, to be listened to with a sensitive discipline, and to be invited that maybe there are other ways to think about themselves. And when they judge themselves, to look at that. And what's it like not to be judged by me? because that's what it means to experience the grace of God. And there's so many people in our world that have never experienced that. Or if they had, it's fleeting, and they were not able to locate it in themselves, right? So I see that and feel that deeply as a therapist, and so believe about the use of spiritual and religious resources, but also the embodiment of that in the therapeutic relationship that creates the context where people can experience acceptance and unconditional positive regard and then begin to integrate that into themselves. It's one thing for me to believe it, and I believe it about all the clients I see, believe it about everybody. It's another for the client to make that shift. Sometimes it's very hard, because it is. And maybe you struggle with it too. Believing that you are enough, just the way you are. You don't have to be this or that. You are enough, just the way you are. And that embodies a spiritually integrated psychotherapeutic approach, as well as how the client then makes meaning for themselves. So very much I use the example of Staupitz's relationship with Luther in a more 21st century model, of course. I don't usually tell a client they're silly or yell at them. I don't think I've ever yelled at a client. But, invite the challenge. So it's not cheap grace for those of you who are Lutherans, but it is grace that invites people to live into who they've been created to be. So let me just add, and I want to do two things. I'm going to give you a few statistics. The most recent I could find is 2017. And then I want to play a song for you that, for me, kind of represents a spiritually integrated psychotherapeutic approach and invites us all to live into that. So here's some statistics. You may have heard these. They're from KMH. Over 2 million Canadians aged 15 years and older have a mental health-related disability. This represents 7% of Canadian adults and youth. Among youth, women are twice as likely as men to have a mental health-related disability, and I think there's a variety of reasons why that's true. Nearly half of employed Canadians with a mental health-related disability feel that one or more of their conditions makes it difficult to change or advance in their job. So there's big implications on work productivity and the workplace when we don't take mental health seriously. 4 of the most frequently reported mental health conditions are anxiety, depression, which is what I said earlier. That's a lot of what we see at the Glebe Center. But underneath anxiety and depression, there will be things like trauma. There'll be addictions. There'll be other things that are mixed in, relationship issues, attachment problems that occurred from ongoing childhood. So anxiety and depression can be sort of the first thing you see, but then as you begin to work with people, you begin to see some of the complexity, just like with Luther, that contributed to the experiences of anxiety and depression. And then bipolar comes in there, disorder, which is the mania on the one side, and then the depressive experience on the other side, and then severe stress disorders like PTSD, which we see as well. So over 1 million Canadians with a mental health-related disability say they require counseling. 519,400 received it but require more. 286,400 required counseling but did not receive any. It's a lot of people floating out there without help. It's also a lot of people who had some but not enough. And in particular, when the Glebe Center started in 2013, I was particularly attentive to our offering therapeutic services to children and adolescents, because that is always an underserved group in a community. And if we can work with kids and adolescents and work with it early, we don't have to worry when they're 45 and everything is falling apart. Right? So we work with children and adolescents. We also do art Art therapy, play therapy that we can sometimes use with adults as well. We're starting to use music therapy because we're using some other space than just the house, because talking isn't always the preferred modality for everybody, right? We also offer therapy in 13 different languages, because when you have people who have come to Canada and English is their second language, when they're doing this kind of healing and change process, sometimes it doesn't work very well to always have to be translating in your head in terms of what you want to say. So we have therapists who can work in their language of origin. And we've worked very hard to not have a wait list, and we don't currently. We've started a walk-in clinic on Fridays for both community members and for university students. And we're bursting at the seams. We did almost 7,000 hours of counseling last year. So part of me wishes we could work ourselves out of a job. It's kind of like the food bank, right? Like, why do we have to have a food bank in this country? You'd like to work yourself out of a job. I don't see ourselves working ourselves out of a job anytime soon, and so I'm grateful that we can offer the resource so people can get timely access to mental health resources at an affordable fee. We have different fees because we have graduate level interns who work with supervision and professional therapists. So there's my blurb for the glebe.
You are listening to Martin Luther and Care of the Soul by Reverend Dr. Kristine Lund, Interim Principal Dean and Director of Spiritual Care and Psychotherapy Programs at Martin Luther University College. At this point in her presentation, she answers questions from the audience.
Oh, here's one. It seems that anxiety, depression, suicide in universities has increased in the 21st century. Why do you think this is so? It really has. We have many clients at the Glebe Center, that struggle with suicidal ideation, and some who complete, which is such a deep tragedy of the potential that is lost when that occurs. I think it's a complex problem. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think it relates to some of the things I've already spoken to, that we live in very uncertain times. When I graduated from university in 1976, I could have had 4 jobs with an undergrad in psychology. The job market is not the same for university graduates. And if you graduated with a BSc in psych now, you'd work in a group home for $15 an hour. Right? So I think the opportunities in the world are different. The stability of the world, the reliability of the world. I think it sort of feeds the anxiety and the depression that there is there for students. And also students are often not well resourced with family, friends. They're away at school. They may not be making that many friends at school. Some of them are quite isolated. So I think it's a complex problem, which will take a complex solution. One issue that we saw this fall is food scarcity. Can you believe that university students do not have enough food to eat? I was horrified when I heard about that at the Glebe Center in November. We had students coming to the Glebe who did not have food to eat because because of the changes to government funding and because the increased rent in Kitchener-Waterloo, they were needing to choose between tuition and rent and food. Well, you know how important good nutrition is for mental health and other health, and how that then impacts academic success. So Luther took the lead in doing some things around food security. We did a lot of food raising for the University Food Bank. Ann Anderson, who's our community pastor, organized a community kitchen down at Emmanuel United because students can walk that far. They made simple meals, took them back in containers, they could have them. And we're continuing to do that this term because I just cannot believe that students do not have enough food to eat in KW. But that's the truth. Like the students are so pressured on so many fronts that mental health is greatly challenged. So it's a multifocal problem that we're trying to work with in a variety of ways. So that's one answer. Were any evil curing procedures performed on Martin Luther? I don't think so, not from what I read. I mean, with his constipation and digestive issues and gout, certainly the doctor as I read, the doctor were giving him medicines, but I don't think they were bloodletting or any of those kinds of things. Were men also given the ultimate cure of execution to drive out the devil, or mainly women? My understanding of the history is that it happened much more to women than men. Because we've always been a problem. But I think there are ways when you start to define normal behavior, and when women are seen as emotional and not rational, then it's not that hard for women to get outside of what's narrowly defined as normal by the men who had the power of the day, right? So I don't know that there were more women who had mental health issues than men in the Middle Ages. I don't know. I haven't done that kind of research. But I suspect, because women respond differently than men often, I mean, there's emotional men too, so let me not, make them that they don't. But I think, in that day and age, it was easier for women to get outside of what was defined as normal. And that's really what launched the asylum system, is the community was starting to define what was normal in more narrow terms. And that has continued since the 19th century. Because now the DSM has something like, 500 diagnoses. Are we really that much more ill than the last version that had 300? I don't think so. I think the definition of normal keeps getting smaller. Right? And, we can have a long conversation about that. But I don't know that there were, I don't think there were as many men. Which is more important, behavior change or radical acceptance? I think they're related, right? I think when we're able to radically accept who we are, and that's a DBT term. Radical acceptance comes out of dialectical behavior therapy. When we're able to accept ourselves, then it also allows us to change our behavior. But sometimes when you're working with a client and they can change behaviors, it also then can help them move into more self-compassion, self-accepting stances. So I think they're kind of related, and I think it would depend on the client which door you go through, right? Okay. Did Luther's agonizing ease after he came to the realization that we are saved by grace alone through faith alone? I wish I could say yes. He still agonized, but in a different way. I don't think he was racked with fear in the same way. I don't think he didn't so compulsively and obsessively go to the confessional. But if you read Luther's writings, you can see where the ongoing conversations happened with Staupitz, but also with others of his colleagues. Because, theological worldview change doesn't happen in an instant, right? It's not like Paul on the Damascus Road, right? It takes time, and Luther was grappling this. And of course that would impact his experience of his own self. And the other reality was that his life was threatened, right? The Pope, the Catholic Church didn't wake up every morning and give thanks to God for Luther, right? He had to hide, so there were a lot of stresses that also impacted Luther's life. But as you read in his later life, he had good colleagues and he had good friends that discussed all these things. And he met with his students, and, table talk is a lot of the recordings of those conversations. Somebody else was writing them down. And so I think he was grappling things, but I don't think he was so frantic or so desperate. And we know, and you can go online and see this, that there were a lot of people watching Luther die. And this might seem strange to us in the 21st century. There is actually a death mask made of Luther's face and his hands because the followers of Luther wanted to prove that he died peacefully. And if he didn't die peacefully, then that would have proved that he didn't believe what he taught. So if you go online, we saw this when we were in Germany, the death mask is there, and the hands, it looks a little gruesome, but his face looks fine. Like it's not all contorted or afraid, or like he didn't die a death that wasn't peaceful. And so that for Luther's followers and for others in the community, this confirmed that he actually did believe what he taught about God's grace. And at the moment of death, he didn't flip into being afraid about whether or not he would be good enough to get into heaven. So again, in the 21st century, we might think that's kind of weird. But in the Middle Ages, that's kind of how they proved it and what they did. So you could go home and Google Luther's death mask, and you'll find it. How do you measure the quality of the client-therapist relationship? Well, that's a really good question. Okay, how would I do that? I think the quality of the client and therapeutic relationship is really dependent on the client's evaluation of it, right? I mean, I might think it's great, but if it's not working for the client, then it's not great. So in the best case scenario, the therapeutic relationship is a collaborative working relationship where each of us brings our expertise to address the concerns of the client, right? The client knows themselves best. And they have the expertise on what's worked, what's not worked, and all of what they bring to the table. I, as the therapist, bring my life experience, my professional experience, my education, and together we work things out. But it really is the client who determines whether or not this is a good relationship for them, not me, because it needs to be what fits for them. So I think how I would measure the quality of the therapeutic relationship would be, how does the client experience the relationship in a way that supports the healing and change that needs to occur for them? And do they experience the therapeutic relationship as a place where they feel accepted, where they can grapple with things, where they can be honest with themselves, where they can ask questions and judgments aren't made about those, all of those kinds of things. And I think that's what contributes to a good quality therapeutic relationship. Probably could write a dissertation on that. And the last one is, did Staupitz have an imbalance of power with Luther when he chose to remain in the Catholic Church? When Luther moved toward complete Reformation, what were the values and motivations for Staupitz? Should have asked Bob Kelly that question. He's the historian. Luther remained an Augustinian monk. Like, his intention was not to become Lutheran. His intention was to reform the Catholic Church. So to that degree, Staupitz would still have remained in a position of power. But at the same time, as things started to go down the path, Luther became increasingly unable to stay in the Catholic Church, right? And so then, I mean, I can't give you dates or anything, but I think there would have been a time when then Staupitz wouldn't have had the same authority over him, because he would not have been a participating member in the Augustinian monastery. But Luther's self-understanding was still very much as being a monk or an Augustinian friar. So I think it gets, I mean, yeah, there's more formal things and then there's informal things. And I think Staupitz didn't follow Luther. Like, there's a whole bunch of historical stuff that happens in here and disputes, and it's kind of an interesting history to read. But I think at the end of the day, Staupitz didn't follow with the reformers because he didn't want to break with the Catholic Church. And his investment was in the Catholic Church, and it wasn't in the Reformation. There's nothing to indicate, though, that Staupitz and Luther did not remain friends. Like, it doesn't, there's nothing that I've seen anyways that says there was a breach in the relationship. So I think they kind of went their different ways because they had different perspectives on things, but then there was still, a friendship between the two of them. So that's the last question I've got, and I think I'm over time. So anyways, thank you for your attention.
You've been listening to Martin Luther and Care of the Soul, the 6th talk in an 8-lecture series titled Shifting Paradigms, Martin Luther's Enduring Global Impact. This lecture series was presented at Rim Park in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada through January and February 2020 by Martin Luther University College and Third Age Learning, KW. Thank you for joining us. If you would like more information about Third Age Learning KW and its upcoming lectures, visit the website at tal-kw.ca. And for more information on Martin Luther University College and its programs, visit the school's website at luther.wlu.ca.